Welcome back to Occult Archives,
Yeah.
the show where we kind of like to, dive into these old books.
Right, right. The books that most people would probably, well, not exactly take to the beach.
Yeah, not exactly light reading. And today's a perfect example of that.
Yeah, this one's a classic. Yeah, it's got that 17th century charm.
17th century, okay.
John French's The Art of Distillation.
Okay, the art of distillation. So are we talking like making gin in bathtubs here?
Not quite, but there's definitely a connection. It's I mean, think of it more like a really early chemistry textbook, but with a twist, a kind of alchemical twist.
The alchemy? Right. So not just like your average homebrewing guide.
No, no, no. This
No.
is deeper than that. It's about trying to unlock the secrets of nature.
Yeah.
The hidden powers.
Episode 181, The Fire Within. John French's Alchemical Legacy in the Art of Distillation. That's a pretty hefty title for a book about, well, distillation.
Right, but it hints at what they were really trying to do. It wasn't just about making stuff. It was about uh, transforming things. Purifying them, and even maybe achieving something more.
Okay, so like they believe they could actually transform like lead into gold.
Well, that was the big dream, right?
Yeah.
But even if they never quite got there, the processes they developed were still pretty amazing for the time, and the way they thought about matter and energy and how things worked, it's fascinating.
So let's get into it. Like where do we even start with something like this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the equipment, because these guys were, I mean, they were pretty ingenious when it came to building the tools of their trade.
Tools of the trade. Okay. So like we're talking furnaces and things like that.
Exactly. Furnaces were key, and French describes a whole range of designs. You've got your basic ones. It's like, imagine like a kettle on a trivet over a fire.
Yeah.
Very simple.
Stone Age stuff.
But then he also talks about more complex setups, things like reverberation furnaces.
Reverberation. So that sounds impressive. What is that?
It's a way of heating things more evenly.
Yeah.
Like, instead of the flames directly hitting the material you're working with, the heat is reflected, so it's more gentle and controlled.
Gentle and control. I guess that makes sense if you're trying to, extract those delicate essences or whatever.
Exactly. And he talks a lot about controlling the heat in general,
Hmm.
using dampers and ventilation holes to adjust the temperature.
So it's not just about blasting it with as much fire as possible.
No, no, no. It's about understanding how different levels of heat can affect different substances,
Hmm.
and how to use that heat precisely to achieve the desired outcome.
Okay. So we've got our furnace going. What are we putting stuff in? Like what kind of containers did they use?
Oh, that's a great question. They were actually pretty picky about their materials.
Picky, huh?
Oh yeah. For example, he specifically says to avoid lead.
Lead. Why lead?
He noticed that when you heat certain things in lead containers, it kind of, well, it contaminates them, turns them a milky white. And he thought it could even make the final product, dangerous.
Dangerous. Okay, so no lead. Got it. What about what did he like to use?
Well, he mentions copper and iron and tin. Those were all good.
Hmm.
But his favorites were things like jug metal, glazed potter's metal, and especially glass.
Glass. Seems kind of fragile for all this heating and stuff.
Yeah, it was definitely tricky to work with. But the advantage of glass was, well, you could see what was happening inside the vessel, and it didn't react with the substances as much as other materials.
Okay, so like a modern day beaker almost.
Yeah, exactly. Although I don't think they were quite as precise with their measurements back then.
Yeah.
And of course, if you had the money, silver was always an option.
Silver. Wow, that's fancy.
Yeah, but even then, French notes that
Yeah.
silver can be very changeable, meaning it could react with certain alchemical ingredients.
So it's not just about the bling factor, huh? It's gotta work for the process.
Exactly.
Okay, so we got our fancy furnace going, we've got our glass beaker. Now we need to keep everything sealed up tight, right?
Right. That's where the lutes come in.
Lutes. What are lutes? Some kind of medieval sealant?
Basically, yeah, they're these pastes or mixtures that you use to seal the cracks and joints of the vessels and make sure no vapors escape.
Okay, so like an early form of caulk or something.
Yeah, something like that. But the recipes are pretty interesting. I mean, he uses all kinds of stuff.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, his best loot involved a mixture of loam and sand.
Hmm.
Like basic dirt.
Dirt, huh?
But then he adds salt water to it
Mm.
to make it stronger. And then the fun part,
Okay, the fun part? I'm intrigued.
he adds something called caput mortuary, which is basically the leftover residue from distilling strong acids.
Acids. Okay, this is getting a little bit dangerous now.
Well, yeah, be careful. But this caput mortuary, he mixed it with iron filings, and that created a really, really strong seal, one that could withstand a lot of heat.
Okay, so we're talking like industrial strength sealant here.
Yeah. And then he had other variations. You know, sometimes he would add flax or crushed glass or even like bits of pottery to give it different properties.
Okay, so it's not one size fits all. It depends on what you're distilling.
Right. And then for really volatile substances, things that could easily evaporate, he had another trick. He would use unslaked lime mixed with linseed oil.
Linseed oil, like the stuff you use to finish wood.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But when you mix it with the lime, it hardens into a really strong airtight seal.
It's a 17th century epoxy. Pretty clever.
Yeah. And you know, if they needed something simpler, they could just use an ox bladder.
An ox bladder. What?
Yeah. They would moisten it with egg white, and that would create a pretty good seal once it dried. You know, just stretch it over the opening of the container and let it dry.
Okay, that's resourceful.
Yeah, they were nothing if not resourceful.
And what about when things went wrong? Like, what if a glass vessel cracked?
Oh, they had a fix for that too.
A fix, like some kind of 17th century super glue.
Not quite super glue, but pretty ingenious. They would take a piece of linen cloth, soak it in egg white, and then apply it to the crack. And then while it was still wet, they would sprinkle unslaked lime on top of it.
Lime. Again with the lime.
Yeah, it seems to have been a pretty versatile ingredient. And then once that dried, they would repeat the process, like do another layer of cloth and lime, and that would actually hold pretty well.
So like a primitive form of fiberglass or something?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it wouldn't be pretty, but
Right.
but it worked. And he even mentions using quicksilver.
Quicksilver, mercury.
Yeah, mercury says you can use it to seal a crack so well that the glass will actually break somewhere else before the sealed crack gives way.
Wow. I guess that shows you how strong mercury is, or how desperate they were to save their glassware.
Probably a bit of both.
Okay, so they had their equipment, they had their sealants, but when you actually start reading French, you realize he's not just talking about, you know, basic chemistry. There's a whole other language going on here, like a whole alchemical vocabulary.
Absolutely. It's like learning a new language, right? You gotta understand the terminology to even know what he's talking about.
So, like a glossary or something?
Well, luckily French actually does provide some definitions. You know, he explains some of the key terms.
Which is helpful.
Helpful.
Yeah, I bet. So, where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with some of the basics, like lutation, for example.
Yeah.
That just means the process of sealing and coating the vessels.
Lutation. Okay, so basically what we were just talking about.
Exactly. And then you have maceration and digestion.
Yeah.
He uses those terms pretty much interchangeably.
Interchangeably. Okay, and what do they mean?
It's basically just soaking something in a liquid to extract its essence, you know, like making tea. But usually for a lot longer, and sometimes with heat involved.
Okay, so steeping, like a super-powered steeping process.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. And then there's maturation, which is a bit different. That's more about letting something ripen or age.
Yeah.
You know, to reach its full potential.
Like aging wine or cheese.
Yeah, exactly. And the liquid that they use for maceration or digestion, that's called the menstruum.
Menstruum. Okay, so that's just a fancy word for solvent.
Yeah, basically. And then we have precipitation, which is it's the process of separating a solid from a liquid.
So like if you boil salt water and the water evaporates and you're left with the salt.
Yeah, that's a good example. And then purification, of course, that's just, you know, getting rid of any impurities, making something as pure as possible.
Makes sense. And then he talks about putrefaction, which sounds a little gross.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But in alchemy, it has a slightly different meaning. It's not just about things rotting. It's about breaking down a substance using gentle heat to separate its components.
Okay, so controlled decomposition, not just like leaving something to rot in the sun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the big one, quintessence.
Quintessence.
Uh,
Okay, that's one I've heard before, like the purest essence of something.
Right. The most concentrated, most powerful part.
The good stuff.
Yeah, the good stuff. And to get to that quintessence, they would often use a process called rectification, which is basically just distilling something over and over again to purify it further.
So multiple distillations,
Yeah.
like filtering it through multiple levels.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have reverberation, which is another way of heating things.
Didn't we talk about that earlier with the furnaces?
Yeah, we did. But it's also a more general term for a specific kind of calcination, which means reducing something to ash.
Okay, so like burning something until all that's left is the ash.
Right. And solution is, well, that's just dissolving something in a liquid.
Okay, that one's pretty straightforward. What about stratification?
Stratification is, it's about layering different substances, usually corrosive powders, to create a more controlled reaction.
Controlled reaction. So like making sure things don't explode.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then we have sublimation, which is a really interesting one.
Sublimation. What's that all about?
It's when a solid turns directly into a vapor without melting first. And then that vapor cools and solidifies again, but into a really fine powder.
So like it skips the liquid stage altogether.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's subtiliation, which is kind of a broader term for making something really, really fine, whether it's a powder or a liquid.
Okay, subtiliation, making things finer. Got it. And then there's the big one that everyone always talks about, transmutation.
Ah, yes. Transmutation, the ultimate alchemical goal.
Turning lead into gold.
Well, yeah, that was the dream. But transmutation, more broadly, just means changing the nature of a substance, transforming it into something different.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be, literally turning lead into gold. It could be any kind of transformation.
Right. And finally, we have volatile.
Yeah.
Which just means something that evaporates easily.
Volatile, like gasoline or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, understanding all these terms, it really helps to decode what French is talking about, to get a sense of how they saw the world.
Absolutely. It's like learning the secret code of alchemy.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've got their fancy equipment, their weird lutes, and their secret alchemical language.
Yeah.
But French also gives a lot of practical advice, like things to keep in mind when you're actually doing these experiments.
Right. He lays out some ground rules.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how much emphasis he puts on safety.
Safety. Well, yeah, I guess working with fire and strong acids and stuff, that could be pretty dangerous.
Exactly. So his first rule is all about choosing the right location for your furnace.
So not in your bedroom, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. He says ideally you want a place with a chimney, especially if you're working with anything that could produce, harmful fumes.
Okay, so good ventilation. Check. What else?
Well, he's also very specific about not overfilling your vessels.
Don't overfill. Okay, that's good advice for cooking too.
Yeah. But in this case, it's even more important because
Yeah.
if you overfill the vessel, it could boil over, and that could be dangerous depending on what you're working with.
Okay, so no exploding cauldrons.
Exactly. And he even gives specific fill levels for different types of containers. Like for gourds, you should only fill them a quarter full. For retorts, it's half full. And for copper vessels, it's a third full.
Wow, that's pretty precise, for someone who's working with, dirt and ox bladders.
Right. It shows you how much they were paying attention to the details. And he's also got special instructions for certain types of materials, like things that are very volatile.
Yeah.
Or things that tend to foam up when you heat them.
Okay, so tricky ingredients. Got it. What do you do with those?
Well, he says to use smaller quantities.
Yeah.
And bigger vessels. And sometimes you have to add things like salt or sand to prevent them from bubbling over too much.
Salt and sand. Okay, so like the alchemical equivalent of baking soda for a volcano science project.
Yeah, kind of. And he's also very clear about not applying too much heat, even to things that need to be heated.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot. Not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly. And, of course, he emphasizes the importance of those lutes, making sure they're strong and airtight.
Right. No leaks. We talked about that.
Yeah, but it's worth repeating because a leaky lute could really ruin your whole experiment. And he also points out that different substances behave differently when you distill them.
Differently. How so?
Well, for example, he says that acids tend to release their weaker parts first, and then the stronger parts come later. But with fermented liquids, it's the opposite. The spirit comes out first, and then the watery stuff comes later.
Okay, so you gotta know what you're working with.
Exactly. And then there's the problem of emperiuma.
Empariuma. That sounds like a Harry Potter spell or something.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But it just means a smoky or brunt flavor that can sometimes get into the final product.
Okay, so like you burnt your dinner.
Yeah, someone like that. But French has some tips for getting rid of that smoky flavor, like exposing the container to sunlight or storing it in a cold, moist place.
Interesting. So like letting it air out basically.
Yeah, that's the idea. And he also gives a lot of advice on using water baths. The balneum muriatum.
Balneum Murray, that's another one of those fancy alchemical terms. What is that exactly?
It's basically just a double boiler, like a pot of water with another container sitting inside it.
Okay, so indirect heat, gentle heating.
Right. And he says that when you're using a water bath, it's important to start with hot water.
Yeah.
So you don't crack the glass.
Right, so no sudden temperature changes.
Exactly. And he even has ways of intensifying the heat of the water bath, like adding sand or sawdust to the water.
Sand and sawdust. Huh. So like making it thicker so it holds the heat better.
Yeah, exactly. And he even talks about using horse dung as a heat source.
Horse dung.
Yeah. Apparently, if you layer it with unslaked lime in a pit, it creates a nice steady heat as it decomposes. Perfect for those long, slow digestions.
Okay, that's pretty resourceful. I got to give him that.
Yeah. And then he even talks about the importance of sifting your sand and ashes.
Sifting sand and ashes. Why?
Well, because if there's any little stones or bits of debris in there, they could crack the glass when you're heating it.
Yeah.
So he says to make sure everything is nice and smooth.
Attention to detail. That seems to be a recurring theme here.
It is. It is. And then he talks about the time it takes for things to putrefy and how that can vary depending on what you're working with and even the weather.
The weather, really?
Yeah. He says that green, wet plants putrefy faster than dry ones, and minerals take the longest. And he even noticed that cloudy weather seemed to speed up the process.
Huh. Who knew?
Right. And he gives a really interesting tip for preserving vegetables.
Preserving vegetables? What, like 17th century canning?
Kind of. He says to store them in sealed earthenware vessels in a cool place, and that'll help them last longer.
Practical advice from an alchemist.
Yeah. And then he makes a really important point about not discarding the leftover residues from distillation. The stuff that's left behind in the vessel.
So don't throw away the leftovers. Okay.
Exactly. Because he says that even those residues can still contain valuable essences.
Interesting. So it's all about getting the most out of your ingredients.
Yeah. And the overall message I get from all these rules is that you have to be very careful, very meticulous, and you have to pay attention to every detail.
So it's not just about, throwing a bunch of stuff in a pot and hoping for the best.
No. It's a very precise and deliberate process.
Okay, so we've got our equipment. We know how to use it safely. We've learned the secret alchemical language. Now let's get to the good stuff. What are they actually making with all this? That's
where things get really interesting, because French goes into a lot of detail about specific distillations and preparations, and it's an amazing range of stuff.
So, like recipes?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. Recipes for all kinds of things, from simple waters to complex elixirs.
Okay, so like, what's a simple water?
Well, he starts off with waters distilled from fruits, things like berries or even rotten apples.
Rotten apples. Not sure I'd want to drink that.
Yeah, maybe not.
Okay.
But he says they have medicinal properties. They can induce sweating or reduce fever.
Okay, so 17th century medicine.
Exactly. And then he moves on to more potent things like aquavitae and spirit of wine.
Aquavitae, spirit of wine. So basically hard liquor.
Yeah, pretty much. And he describes how to make them through multiple distillations, distilling the wine over and over again to concentrate the alcohol.
Makes sense. So like going from wine to brandy, basically.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And then he talks about making magisteries and oils of wine, which are they're kind of mysterious.
Hmm.
It's not clear exactly what they are or what they're used for, but it seems like they were thought to have some kind of special properties.
Special properties. Okay, so like more than just getting drunk.
Yeah, yeah. It's hinting at something more alchemical, something transformative.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What else?
Well, then he gets into extracting the spirit of various vegetables.
Spirit of vegetables. What does that even mean?
It's basically just extracting the volatile components, the parts that easily evaporate. And he does this using aquavitae or low wines as the
Yeah.
menstruum.
So like using alcohol to pull out the essence of the vegetables?
Exactly. And he even distinguishes between a stronger spirit and a weaker spirit or water, which are they're just different fractions that you collect during the distillation process.
Okay, so like different grades of vegetable extract.
Yeah, something like that. And then he talks about different types of alembics, those funny-looking glass contraptions with the long necks.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of those.
Right. And he describes how different alembics are used for different purposes.
Okay, so like specialized tools for different jobs.
Right. And he even gives a method for quickly extracting the spirit from vegetables using yeast and warm water.
Yeast, like the stuff you use to make bread.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically a way of speeding up the fermentation process.
Okay, so like fast tracking the breakdown of the plant material.
Right. And then he gets into more complex extractions like how to get the essence and quintessence of herbs.
Essence and quintessence. Okay, so like the really really concentrated stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this often involved a whole series of steps, putrefaction,
Yeah.
distillation, calcination, sometimes even imbibition.
Imbibition. What's that?
It means soaking the residue in oils or salts to further extract the essence.
Okay, so it's a pretty involved process.
It is. But they believed it was worth it
Yeah.
because they were trying to get to the very heart of the herb, the most potent part.
Okay, so it's not just about, making a simple herbal tea. This is next level stuff.
Right. And the range of materials that they use is just incredible. I mean, we're talking everything from woods and gums to things like myrrh and tartar and jasmine.
Okay, so a pretty wide variety of plant-based stuff.
Yeah. But then it gets even weirder because he also talks about using animal products.
Animal products, like what kind of animal products?
Well, I mean, he mentions things like dove's dung, horse dung, hartshorn, swallows, eggs, hair, even milk.
Okay, that's getting a little strange.
It is. It is. But they believe that all these things had medicinal properties.
Mhm.
Different animals had different virtues.
Okay, so like a very holistic view of medicine.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
And he also talks about rectifying spirits and oils. Using acid spirits to purify them further.
Okay, so always trying to make things more pure, more concentrated.
Exactly. And he gives recipes for making dissolving menstruums. Special liquids that could dissolve certain substances.
So like alchemical solvents.
Yeah, exactly. And he describes how to make Paracelsus's famous Elixir subtilitatis.
Elixir subtilitatis. That sounds pretty potent.
It was. And he also gives recipes for all kinds of compound waters and spirits. Things for treating specific ailments, like scorbutical water for scurvy, or spirit of castor, or bezoar stone water for infection.
Okay, so like 17th century pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, pretty much. And then he gets into the really strong stuff, like how to make spirit of salt ammoniac, and oil of vitriol, and aquafortis, and even aqua regia.
Aqua regia, the king of waters.
Yeah.
The stuff that can dissolve gold.
Yeah, that one's pretty impressive. And he talks about working with antimony and mercury, which are they're pretty dangerous substances.
Dangerous, yeah, I can imagine.
He describes how to make butter of antimony and how to turn quicksilver into a water, which is it sounds kind of paradoxical.
Quicksilver into water. Okay, that's some serious alchemy there.
Yeah, it is. And then he talks about spiral furnaces for sublimation and for really intense distillations.
Okay, so they're really pushing the limits here.